Hi folks, this is the YouTube video that corresponds with my PowerPoint for Chapter 6, Motown, Pop, and Southern Soul by Covach and Flory. I would like you to have two screens open right now, this video on YouTube and another tab which is the PowerPoint for Chapter 6. You can find that in Blackboard in the content folder PowerPoints. And each of these YouTube videos I make is intended to last about 5-10 minutes, and it will cover about 5 or 10 slides in the PowerPoint and conclude with a question that I'd like you to respond to in Blackboard, what I'm calling an online exit slip. So let's pause right now if you need to make sure that the PowerPoint is open, and come on back. So now I'm on slide 2 of the Motown, Pop, and Southern Soul. This is a bit of a review. We got into this right before spring break, but I'll just kind of catch us all up from the beginning of Chapter 6. Big changes that are happening in the United States in the late 1950s and early 1960s as they apply to the attitudes towards African American popular music are that it's becoming more and more acceptable for white middle-class American audiences to explore black music. And we've been talking extensively about the way African American musical traditions have affected American musical traditions throughout America's history. Ragtime, jazz, blues, Broadway, Tin Pan Alley, all of these styles of music leading up to jump blues and rock and roll are deeply, deeply affected by what's happening in the African American musical community. But a lot of that African American musical tradition is traditionally consumed and performed by African Americans for African Americans. Radio and records are going to bring in the youth market from people outside of the African American community as soon as radio and record becomes available to young people beginning in the 1920s. But still in the 1950s, African American musical traditions are not widespread in terms of their popularity among all American audiences. That changes with rock and roll. And Elvis Presley is going to introduce a lot of these African American rhythm and blues traditions and call and response singing styles, and so many of the rock and roll foundations of the birth of rock and roll that Elvis and the Righteous Brothers and many of these white rock and roll musicians of the birth of rock and roll are going to introduce to other white audiences in the 1950s. They are going to open many doors so that people like Berry Gordy Jr. are able to found Motown Records in 1959 and introduce a whole crop of African American musicians to a whole new audience of Americans. And this is, I think, one of the key things to consider about what's changing in American popular culture in the 1960s. We've already discussed the way the Brill building approach came out of the payola scandal, how much of the birth of rock and roll and its feistiness was tamped down for much more conservative lyrics, the teen idols, the relatively safer songs of the Brill building approach compared to the earlier heyday of the mid-1950s. But in the early 1960s, with Motown Records and the Supremes and the Temptations and many of those popular groups, we're now going to see African American musicians that are going to be more popular outside of African American communities. And that's a big shift for the American economy and its pop culture. So Berry Gordy Jr., I'm shifting on to slide 3 right now. Berry Gordy Jr. originally wants to get started as a jazz producer, and he opens a record store, and he expects to be selling what he considers to be really fantastic music by cool jazz musicians like Miles Davis or bebop musicians like Dizzy Gillespie and Charlie Parker. But what he quickly discovers is that the music that he thought was the most interesting, these jazz records, are not selling nearly as well as the rock and roll records by Chuck Berry and Little Richard. So Berry Gordy Jr. changes gears rather quickly, and by 1959, he has refocused his energy on producing and creating acts that feature African American musicians to be consumable and approachable to as many different audiences as possible. And Motown Records is, I think we've mentioned already, going to become not only one of the most successful record companies in the United States, it's going to become it is going to become the most successful business in America that is owned by an African American. It's very distinctive on many levels for the way it not only changed music history, but also American history. But it has several aspects in Berry Gordy's strategy with Motown Records that are going to borrow from other strategies that were popular and successful, but with other record companies. For example, we discussed the Wrecking Crew, a series of talented professional musicians that were featured on many of the records that were coming out from multiple agencies throughout the 50s and 60s. The Wrecking Crew was on, they were the talented guitarists and drummers and bass players on records as diversified as groups from the Beach Boys to the Righteous Brothers. They were everywhere. These same core musicians were on many different artists' records. Likewise, with Motown Records, there was a dedicated group of studio musicians known as the Funk Brothers. And the Funk Brothers, these were not the guys who had their face on the album, but these were the guys who were playing really professional, talented licks on the bass and the guitar and the drums and the backup vocals and whatever horns were necessary that the artist needed for that sound. The Funk Brothers were the studio musicians who you would hear on everything from the Supremes to the Temptations to the Four Tops. If it was a Motown record coming out of the 60s, the Funk Brothers were the dedicated background musicians who made it happen behind the celebrity in front. So that was a consistent model, a consistent strategy that Berry Gordy Jr. did. One of the things, though, that he did that was different was he also was aware that he was breaking new ground for African American musicians in a country that had a long history of not treating African Americans very well. And he was eager to make sure that the music that was coming out of his studios in Motown was not just going to be for African American audiences. He wanted it to be for white audiences as well. And his strategy to pull that off was quite controversial with many of his artists who balked at the idea that they had to take classes with finishing school teachers, that they had to learn white culture etiquette. But these were contractual obligations that Motown artists had to do. They had to basically learn how to engage in the traditions of white society so that when they went to a premiere, when they went to a concert, when they engaged with press, they would be able to present themselves in a way that wouldn't alienate them from, frankly, a widely, potentially racist audience. So much of the music that is coming out of Motown Records is going to, again, be performed by African Americans, but it is adjusted so that it will be consumable and approachable to people who are not familiar with African American musical traditions. And this is going to create some of the compare-contrast coming in Chapter 6 about what is the difference between sweet soul and Southern soul. And as many of your authors and experts are going to try to tease this apart in many of the assigned listenings for this chapter, sweet soul is going to be an African-American style of music, of popular music, that is based on gospel traditions and is going to feature a lot of African-American artists. However, much of that music is going to be adjusted or changed so that the authentic African-American experience is not as obvious, and it is going to be not as highly improvised. It is going to have a lot of consistency. Every take is going to try to sound exactly the same. Again, in a very in a process that so white audiences who are hearing these things on the radio think, oh, that sounds very similar to what I've already been hearing in these other groups that I'm already familiar with. And essentially, Berry Gordy's strategy, it does work. Motown Records is going to cross over from R&B charts into rock charts, into pop charts in ways that other African-American musicians had never been able to do. And as we get later into Southern Soul, though, we will be comparing what is it about Southern Soul that doesn't try to adjust itself so that white audiences will be more comfortable or they'll get it. What is it about Southern Soul that is more authentic to an African-American musical tradition compared to sweet soul or early Motown that is music that is considering both white and black audiences rather than just what sounds good to the artists who are making that music. This is, again, a bit of a controversial discussion, and I would like to hear your thoughts on whether you think Berry Gordy Jr. was on the right track, why he may have taken these decisions or made these policies with Motown Records, and what do you think about that? Thanks.